class begins with salt and pepper, it's going to be a good class. So right off the bat, I think we're in for a treat this evening. Welcome back to the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. I'm Dr. Robert Green II, lead instructor for the school. And of course, today is May 19th, which is the birthday of several key figures in revolutionary history, including Ho Chi Minh, Malcolm X, and Lorraine Hansberry. They were all born on May 19th, albeit in different years. So if you're parents, you're trying to have revolutionary kids, you might want to plan out from 9 months before May 19th, but I digress. Anyways, this evening is going to be a very important class. We're talking about gender and identity, both with South Carolina and more broadly speaking, across the nation, around the globe. And I think this is a topic that is incredibly important because as we consider different identities, we want to be very intentional in thinking about ourselves holistically, not just in terms of gender or race, but also in terms of sexual orientation as well. So this evening we have two very, very special guests, two friends of the Modjeska Simkins School. First up would be Annie Boiter-Jolley, who is an adjunct professor in women and gender studies at USC. She does a lot of work with feminist movement, women's history, both here in South Carolina and across the country. And she has been in South Carolina for over 38 years, which some would say is far too long, but I would say is just right. And then after that, we have Professor Ed Madden, also of the Department of Women's Gender Studies. He was former director of that department. He is currently working on a book about the history of queer Columbia. And correct me if I'm wrong, you were also awarded the USC Board of Trustees Professorship for 2025. Trustee Professorship for 2025. So this is a testament of Dr. Madden's work right here in South Carolina. So please give both of our guests a wonderful round of applause. We're going to start with Annie. She's going to talk a bit about the feminist movement and feminism here in South Carolina and across the country. So please come on.
Hi, everyone. I am Annie Boiter-Jolley. I'm honored to be here and being a part of this session of the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. I've been a huge fan of this program for years now, and so I'm happy to be here. I have a screen to share, and I am. Okay. I am not graphically inclined, so my somewhat minimalist slides will hopefully serve to kind of keep us on track a little bit. I am also inexplicably very nervous right now, so please bear with me as I work through my nerves. All right, so I am going to talk a little bit about some lessons from the women's movement in South Carolina. Women's movement, feminist movement. I'm going to talk in broad terms, kind of put the ment into context, put what was going on in South Carolina into context, and hopefully not rehash things y'all have already gotten super in the weeds with. If y'all have questions or comments or whatever at any point, please just hop on in. And so my presentation here is going to act as a kind of lead in to Dr. Madden's presentation. So there are things that as I move through this, I am not going to touch on, in part because I know that there will be time for them. They will be addressed later on. So yeah. All right. So like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about the South Carolina women's movement in a larger historical context. We're really going to focus on the second wave of the women's movement or feminist movement in South Carolina. We're going to talk about some of the major events, and more importantly, a couple of major themes that that really drove the second wave of the movement, as well as have informed how the third wave has progressed in South Carolina and elsewhere. We'll talk about this idea that the personal is political, and we'll also talk about intersectionality, which will kind of dovetail nicely into Dr. Madden's talk. All right, so again, not wanting to be too redundant here, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page and with the same shared understandings of terminology and everything. So the women's movement comes in waves. I know that y'all have talked a bit about how some of the first wave events manifested in South Carolina. Just to review, the first wave primarily spans the 19th and early 20th century and challenged political and legal barriers like suffrage, women's property rights. Many of the participants in the first wave of the feminist movement came from the anti-slavery movement and other movements as well of the time. But in these other movements that were these other social movements that challenged oppression, that fought for justice in other spheres of life, many of the participants experienced they both gained experience organizing, a really important experience organizing, speaking, working with different kinds of people, but also faced gender-based discrimination. And this is going to be a theme of later movements or later waves in the women's movement as well. And we'll talk about some other overlapping kinds of discrimination in the next few minutes. The first wave culminates with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, but of course, South Carolina would not officially ratify the 19th Amendment until 1969. Obviously, women were allowed many women in South Carolina were granted the right to vote, or were able to exercise their right to vote after the national ratification, but South Carolina itself did not ratify the amendment until 1969. We also know that the 19th Amendment did not cover everybody. Nominally, the 19th Amendment gave all women the right to vote. In practice, women of color in most parts of the country, in many parts of the country, and especially in South Carolina, did not effectively have a guaranteed right to vote until the Voting Rights Act in 1965 worked to enforce the congressional amendment. So not only did South Carolina not officially ratify the 19th Amendment, in effect, many women were left out of the franchise, even when the amendment was ratified. We don't have time to watch this right now, but I wanted to include this slide in, or not slide, this link in the slideshow to remember to ask Cassie to send it along. If you have not watched this clip yet, it's fantastic. It looks at what the story that we've been told about the suffrage movement, about Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, what that story leaves out. It's not South Carolina specific, but because there are a huge proportion of voters in South Carolina were affected by this exclusion, I think it's important to think about, to talk about. It also brings up an issue that I'm personally working on how to engage with in my scholarship, but especially in my teaching right now. And it's something that I just wanted to touch on a little bit here, because I think it may be, it's likely relevant to y'all as you are working through this material, and as you're deciding what to do with what you're learning next. So we know that, you don't get the whole story unless all voices are included, right? We're all on board with that. But we also don't know what we don't know. And one of the things that learning about what we didn't learn about the suffrage movement, for instance, that I think has been important to me, and I like to underline, is that just because there's a narrative that people were excluded doesn't mean that they weren't doing the work. Doesn't mean, just because we don't know what their stories are, don't mean that their stories don't exist. And sometimes because of how stories and storytelling, privileges people who already have privilege, really digging into and finding those stories that have been erased or that have been neglected, and sometimes unintentionally, sometimes maliciously, historically is a huge project. And I'm sorry, I'm off on a tangent, but I think that it's something that the work that the Modjeska School is doing is a huge part of that. And I appreciate that so much. Figuring out what we don't know and then figuring out how to teach about it. Yeah, so the first wave of the women's movement theoretically culminates with the franchise, the voting franchise, but in reality is a really unfinished project. The second wave of the women's movement, and I want to specifically, we're going to come back and talk more specifically about the second wave, because second wave is the portion of the feminist movement that is happening alongside some of the other movements and events that I know you guys have been talking about in recent weeks. So the second wave dates from the early 1960s and focuses on formal and informal equalities in realms of work, education, family, sexuality, reproductive rights, etc. It's a very broad movement. Like with the suffrage movement, many participants in the second wave of the women's movement were active in other parallel movements, active in the civil rights movement, and the anti-war movement, the student movement, other social movements of the era. And again, like the suffrage activists, often faced gender-based discrimination within those other movements. And we're going to talk more thematically in a couple of minutes about what folks did with this experience of kind of simultaneously working to end oppression in one area while actively experiencing oppression in other areas. And we'll talk more about the South Carolina context in just a moment. So the second wave culminates in the 1980s with some internal fracturing and a broader backlash that came along with the Reagan era. The second wave, like the first wave, was not, I guess, was marred by exclusion again, was not always actively inclusive. But what I want to talk, and what we're going to talk about in a minute, is what was happening despite the despite formal barriers to participation, or informal barriers, I'm sorry, informal barriers to participation in the movement. In just a minute, we'll talk about the concept of the personal is political. We'll talk about how activists in the second wave of the feminist movement took their experiences, their lived experiences in their daily lives, and made connections to political systems and larger social structures in a way that took their micro experiences and kind of blew them up to a macro scale. So I'm going to put a pin here in the second wave and come back to that in the context of South Carolina in just a moment. And then finally, the third wave of the women's movement dates from the early 1990s to the present and beyond. The third wave, unlike previous waves, is characterized and characterized by a strong focus on intersectionality. In part as a response to criticisms that the first and second waves had not been inclusive, had left out lots and lots of them, and lots left out the interests of many women. The third wave is also informed by postmodernism and queer theory, and specifically rejects the idea that women are a monolith. The third wave recognizes that gender, or rejects the idea of a gender binary, rejects and challenges kind of binary systems in general, and focuses on inclusivity, focuses on the things that people, the experiences that people share, and the experiences that transcend identity. But I want to focus specifically on the second wave of the women's movement in South Carolina. So the second wave of the movement, the 1960s, 1970s, we know there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in terms of legislation, in terms of court cases. There are a lot of, there's legislation being passed, and then there are court cases being brought to make sure that the legislation is enforced. And so on the national stage, as major legislation and Supreme Court decisions start to change the landscape broadly in terms of gender equality at the national level, a major project of South Carolina feminists was working to make sure that these legal changes were fully implemented at the state level as well. So yes, strides were being made, progress was happening at the national level and federal level. But one of the main challenges that not only South Carolina feminists, but feminists throughout the South faced was how to confront oppression that's masquerading as tradition, or confront oppression that is excused because it is tradition, because that's the way it's always been done, because, oh, people won't accept that, we should be happy with whatever, incremental small changes that have happened. And this is not unique to the women's movement, to the feminist movement. Tradition has a stranglehold on a lot of public policy in South Carolina and surrounding states. And so activists in the South Carolina in the second wave of the South Carolina women's movement faced not only challenges at the national challenges, the same challenges that and the same fights that feminists in New York and California and other places in Nevada and everywhere we're fighting, but also specific challenges to getting people on board in South Carolina. And there's a quote that I particularly liked, as was the case during the suffrage movement. Many South Carolinians viewed the women's rights movement as a Northern invention that women of the South, supposedly better treated, indeed worshipped on a pedestal, should reject. And we know, and I'm sure y'all have talked about instances throughout South Carolina history where women's chastity, women's gentility, how can you be oppressed? We open the door for you, and we protect you, and all of this kind of chivalrous oppression that is hard to you have to go through a process of reframing it, right? You have to go through a process of saying, yes, you open the door for me, but I make 50 cents for every dollar that you make. Yes, you write laws to protect my safety, but I'm not allowed to hold certain jobs, or it is not illegal for, marital rape is not illegal. So there's a lot of, when you think about the feminist movement and the women's movement in South Carolina, there's a lot of what is the situation on the face of things and what is actually happening. And so this is one of the things that second wave feminists were trying to do, were working to do, was to share, to connect with folks in a way that helped them identify issues in their own lives, their own experiences, that they could then connect to larger political issues and political systems. So just a few dates and events. In 1966, Columbia Now was founded. On the national stage in the early 70s, and we'll talk about this more in just a minute, Vicki Esslinger, who was very active in the women's movement, the civil rights movement through today. I don't know if many of y'all have heard of the Page suit. So Vicki Esslinger was a law student at USC and had been nominated to serve as a page in the state Senate. However, because that job required doing things that some people didn't think that women should do or women could do, because they were, quote, girls, she was denied her place. The person who denied her space, she said, sue me, right? It's just the way it is. So she sued him, and and made got a lot of national attention. The suit worked its way through the courts. At one point, future Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg worked on the case as well, and ultimately prevailed. And now there are pages of now anyone can be a page theoretically at the State House. Interestingly, and this kind of goes back to this earlier notion of treating women better, worshiping on a pedestal, etc., and how that might not always work out the way we think it will. One of the major blows that the opposition in this case felt was during the case. During the case, one of the lawyers representing the senator who did not want Esslinger to become a page brought up the idea that this women should not hold this job because they have to visit. It may not be safe for them because sometimes they have to visit senators in their offices in the evening at night. And so this may raise a safety issue. The judge in the case said, well, perhaps this is something that your client is seeking. This is, I don't remember the exact quote, but basically said, hey, maybe this is something she's after, wink, wink. And that, interestingly, at the time, impugning a woman's chastity in South Carolina could be punished by law. So it was that the judge basically making inappropriate remarks or inappropriate comments about Esslinger's intentions that ended up forcing him to recuse himself, and again kind of raise the profile on this case a little bit. So interestingly, one of these protective some of this protective legislation ended up kind of flipping the table a little bit.
No, just about that matter.
Yeah.
I wasn't clear on what he was saying about the safety from the senators.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay,
That's my interpretation, yes.
okay,
Safety, or the idea
good
of,
point.
the idea of women going alone into offices with men at night is,
I
you know,
got you.
yeah, so on it, again, on its face is one thing, that what the actual intention is,
Right.
you know. Um,
Like,
sorry?
it's one of those moments where you're like, can you repeat that again? Like,
Yeah.
can you just say that one more time and let everyone else hear it again?
Yeah,
And then maybe we'll understand, like, because it's like, that, there's no other thing that could have meant, you know?
yes, well, that's just the thing, a lot of protective legislation is, and I guess these are two different things. One is the implication that a young woman would not be safe going into, you know, the offices with, into men's offices in the evening. So that's the implication. And
It was also a boys' club.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the point there, you know, there it was, you know, 98%, if not more, men. And so there's the safety implication there, but then there's also the idea that on the books was a law saying that you could not publicly impugn a woman's chastity, right? So in making this, in saying, well, maybe she's not going to be safe in this situation, there was, I think what it does is it highlights how frankly ridiculous both the implication and the laws on the books were. And there was, you know, this is not the only example of this happening during this time, which I'm not going to get into the weeds on there, because I want to keep moving forward. But there's a lot of, you know, this is how it's always been done. This is our goal is to protect women, and in South Carolina, to protect white women, specifically. And yeah, another point I wanted to make about this point in specifically in Columbia during this time, and kind of on the ground activism at the grassroots level. And this is another Vicki Esslinger story. So in the early 70s, she's a law student and had heard of a number of her colleagues, a number of her fellow students carrying out, undergoing illegal abortions on campus. Either having, you know, being harmed from the procedure, or, you know, if they could not figure out how to make it happen, having to leave school, basically witnessing a wide array of the effects of not having access to legal, safe abortion care in the early 70s, pre-Roe v. Wade. And so Esslinger worked with some other students and the administration and established a reproductive freedom area at USC's Russell House, where 24 hours a day, she and other volunteers maintained a hotline where students could call in, get information about a variety of options related to unplanned pregnancies, information about where they could go out of state to have a legal abortion, where they could seek funding for travel. She even worked with some members of the clergy and on campus and other organizations to provide information for students who were interested in pursuing alternative routes like adoption and support for newborn support and things like that, postpartum support. So it was a broad coalition of folks who worked together to to support students who did not have access to legal abortion, on not just on campus, but while they were at school. And this was pre-Roe, and ultimately had the support of the university administration. But was a result of one person saying, hey, a lot of people, I'm hearing about this problem that a lot of people are having, and this is not a them problem, this is a system problem. In 1973, South Carolina Coalition for the ERA was founded. So the ERA was, after having been introduced in 1923, was finally passed in 1972 and sent out for ratification. So the South Carolina Coalition for the ERA did work here to drum up support for educate folks about what the ERA might do, the Equal Rights Amendment might do for South Carolinians. In 1977, South Carolina sent a delegation, including Modjeska Simkins, to the National ERA Convention in Houston. I think in the study guide, there's a clip from that convention where you can see some of the participants. Vicki Esslinger was another delegate to that convention in 1977. It's really cool footage. South Carolina was one of the few states that had women of color in its delegation in 1977. And ultimately, we know that the ERA, despite the deadline being extended, did not ultimately end up being ratified, although there's some confusion in the last, back in January about whether, about the possibility rose again for the ERA to be enforced, but alas. Okay, so these are things that are happening during the second wave in South Carolina. South Carolina had an incredibly active National Organization of Women chapter. What activists were very active in arguing for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, and a number of other state and local organizations were doing the work on the ground in South Carolina, using their specific knowledge about the role of tradition, the immovable, the somewhat immovable wall of tradition in South Carolina, and figuring out how to engage with folks in a way that that spoke specifically to them. I want to talk a little bit about this concept of the personal, the personal is political. This is a major slogan, major project of the second wave of the women's movement. And it really captured this idea that there's a link between personal change and societal transformation. I don't know if y'all talked about, like, in other contexts, like consciousness raising groups and that sort of thing. But I think this as a concept really captures the idea that the conversations that you have around the table, the conversations that you have informal conversations that you have in the living room, that you have with a friend, sometimes they're whispered conversations, sometimes they're conversations about, does anybody else's boss, act weird around them? When promotion time is up, does anybody, the concept of sexual harassment arose out of some of these conversations where people realized, oh, everybody's experiencing this. This is not something that is off with me and my job. And I think we can take this concept, this personal and political concept, and apply it to not just the feminist movement, but any movement that is concerned with any movement that is concerned with equality, any movement that is concerned with systemic oppression. And it can be it can be a powerful concept especially as a way to reach people who might not otherwise be inclined to be politically active or to be socially active. And sometimes all it does is take that conversation, and the activists in the second wave, otherwise, particularly in South Carolina, knew that. In South Carolina, in the second wave, the theme had a really important connection to reproductive justice. And I use the term reproductive justice kind of in juxtaposition with reproductive rights. It based on the idea that reproductive justice recognizes that even if reproductive rights have been established, there's often differential access based on aspects of a person's identity. And so just because laws are there protecting access in for instance, to contraception now, not everyone has the same access to that legally protected right. And so in South Carolina, this concept of personal is political. It's connected to reproductive justice, is connected to domestic violence against women, things that are often whispered about, things that are often there's sometimes connected to shame. And South Carolina regularly ranks at the top of the list of states where women are killed by men. And during the second wave into the third wave today, it remains an important path to take when we're talking about justice. How am I on time? Am I okay? Sorry? Okay, cool. I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality now as we kind of get a little bit more into the Equal Rights Amendment fight in South Carolina. Intersectionality, have y'all talked about intersectionality as a tool up to this point? All right, so intersectionality in women's and gender studies, in the feminist movement, etc., is a concept, and we often use it as a tool of analysis that looks at how aspects of a person's identity affects how they experience privilege, oppression, and the various systems and institutions that they interact with on a daily basis. Intersectionality was the term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. Crenshaw is a legal scholar, and the term came out of Crenshaw trying to figure out a way to explain that Black women were simultaneously experiencing racial discrimination and gender discrimination, and were not allowed to, in the case, the paper where she's writing about this, we're not allowed to bring suit, we're not allowed to challenge that discrimination because the place where they worked hired men and it hired people of color. So there's no sexism if they hire men, and there's no racism if they hire people of color. But there was no way to explain that they only hired white men, and they only hired the women who they hired were only white, and the men who they hired, the people of color who they hired, were only women. So these women were experiencing this very specific kind of discrimination at the intersection of racial and gender-based discrimination. And so even though the term intersectionality wasn't coined until the late 80s, it's a concept that particularly women of color who have been active in both the feminist movements and in first the anti-slavery and the civil rights movement were very keen to articulate and had been articulating for a couple hundred years now. We call it intersectionality now because it's a very concise, helpful term that I think is easy to visualize. But suffragists and anti-slavery activists were talking about this in, in the mid 19th century. And intersectionality has been really key in the women's movement in South Carolina and in many other southern states as well, because some of the most, in part because there have been more women of color, more women who experience oppression at different junctures of their identity in the room, having these conversations. Yes, racism, discrimination exists in these rooms, but there were also people in these rooms who gave name to these experiences. And another attendee at that 1977 National ERA convention in Houston was Pat Keller, who was a statewide now leader, active in the civil rights movement in South Carolina, active in the feminist movement in South Carolina. And she was particularly interested in articulating not only the unique position that Black women in South Carolina occupied in at this point in the 1970s, but also realizing that at this point, the women's movement, the feminist movement, in some circles had a bad rap as being exclusionary, as prioritizing the interests and needs of white women, often white middle-class women, often straight white cisgender middle-class women. And so one of the things that I think is interesting about the work that she did was said these projects can exist simultaneously. And yes, there are problems, but there are also benefits to staking our claim in this space. And so I just wanted to, I think in her words, I would rather use her words to explain this further. So in her efforts to increase support for the ERA in South Carolina, she writes that the women I was interested in getting into the organization were working class women, poor women, and women of color. I felt like those women were the women who were the most challenged by sexism because they were not being paid as much. They were not getting the jobs that men could get. They were not even as well educated and didn't get the same educational opportunities that even white women had. I felt like that base of women was important to our organizing effort in South Carolina. I went looking for women who worked in the low country of South Carolina, who were working in the kitchens and resort hotels and laundry cleaners and other occupations of that sort. Those were the types of women I targeted. And in this quote, she articulates another aspect of the position that the personal is political, that the personal unique locations that in South Carolina, that women of color, that poor women, that women who lived in rural areas were simultaneously disadvantaged by multiple aspects of their identities. And they were the only ones who could speak to their unique positions. And so trying to bring folks into the organizing, not just, hey, vote for this, or hey, hey, put this sticker on your car, or hey, sign this petition, but hey, organize with us. Hey, tell us what the issues are that you are facing. But also here's what the ERA is in this context. And here's how the ERA might be able to specifically address one aspect of the oppression or the disadvantage that you're facing because of the multitude of identities that you represent. As part of this project, the South Carolina ERA Coalition published a pamphlet called the ERA in the Black community that argued that Black women were caught in two minority groups, which have been discriminated against in our society. We don't get anywhere by comparing the trials of being Black to the trials of being a woman. It's enough to recognize that we are a double minority and that ratification of the ERA would help us as women and as Black women. And this, I like this quote because it recognizes that we cannot extract aspects of our identities. We cannot separate aspects of our identities. Yes, we have experiences based on gender and race and sexuality, but we always experience those things simultaneously. And I want to wrap up there, and I don't know if there's what kind of transition we're looking at here. Okay, that's right. Sorry.
Let's give Annie a round. There. If you have any questions for her, whether in the room or on Zoom, go ahead and ask. Yes, go ahead, please.
I did have a question. Prior to the push to bring in the inclusivity, would you say the profile of the women in this movement were white working women? Were there also women who worked in the home who were part of this movement? And what was their buy-in if they were not part of the
What was their
buy-in? What made them a part of the movement if they were not working outside of the home, but working in, you get me?
Yeah. So I think, so yes, there was definitely a profile, I guess. But there were a wider range. There women who were active in South Carolina now in the fight for the ERA were, yes, some were academics, some were inspired by their experiences in the workplace. There were a lot of women who were inspired by their experiences pursuing reproductive health care. There were people who were experiencing or who were inspired or activated by their experience or the experience of their loved ones with domestic violence. So home issues, kind of this transcending the private and public sphere, and learning how to make those connections and make those leaps. I think a lot of the inspiration for folks getting involved happen in the home, happen in the private sphere.
Gabby, you have a question as well? Go ahead, please.
I have a question about, you said like part of this work is like figuring out what we don't know and then figure out how to teach it.
Mhm.
And that we don't know what we don't know. And I was just wondering like if you could talk more about like how you do that as a historian, especially like women in the South. Literacy wasn't always a guarantee
Mhm.
for women. So how do we find out like where those gaps are? Like how do you do that?
So I don't have the answers, right? But I think, yes, there is an issue with things not being recorded, right?
Right.
With stories not being put down for posterity. One of the things though is that there are people who still have that information. And I think it's one of the reasons that having a bunch of different kinds of people in the room is so important.
Yeah.
And I think it's also really important, and again, I don't know exactly how to do this. I think this school is one of the ways, using or approaching it one of the best ways, and giving people teaching people how to use their voice, how to access their own voice, and helping amplify the voices that are not usually, that are often not only excluded formally, but also kind of like self-excluded, giving people the confidence to say, hey, you are a knowledge creator. You are a knowledge creator. And just because you're not, just because you're not a professor or you're not, whatever, acknowledging, validating what everybody can bring to the table. And I think that's really important. I don't know if that gets at what you were talking about, but
Well, and I think to add to that really quickly, a good example of this in terms of thinking about different groups that have a stake in various social movements, especially the movement for women's rights. Look at the documentary from 1970 called I Am Somebody. It's on YouTube. It's about the 1969 Charleston hospital strike. And it's only 30 minutes long, but the documentary is entirely interviews with the Black women who were on strike in Charleston. And so while they're being part of this larger labor movement, the documentary is very intentional in saying this is the heart and soul of this movement in Charleston. Now, albeit you have clips with Coretta Scott King, with Andrew Young. At one point, they interview the person in charge of MUSC at the time who says, this is a labor rights issue, not a civil rights issue. It's like, what? But it's a rather interesting documentary because it focuses exclusively on the Black women who are at the heart of that movement in a way that in the late 60s, they weren't really thinking about labor in that way, but more folks were beginning to do so.
Thank you.
Just also what Gabby was talking about, I think that question that you raised earlier about safety, was it the safety of the men in the office or the safety of the women who were going to visit? I mean, Cassie was not safe with P. Diddy. So women have to stand up, I think, together and define their own reality and own terminology in order to make movement.
Now-
I kind of watched that happen. There were a lot of complaints. As they brought more women in, and both as pages and as legislators, there were complaints by the pages. And there was a tendency, I don't know exactly who drove it, that they would dress not in a business action. So they actually passed house rules about what they could wear that was pushed to be able to prevent the intersectionality of the pages and the senators and the House members.
All right, we got a couple of questions on Zoom. Let's start first with Taisha and then Penn Center after her.
Good afternoon, well, good evening. Thank you for the lesson. So this is about a documentary that I saw a long time ago. I learned that not all women was for the feminist movement. Like some were against it and even protested it, so they wasn't for it. That's my first comment. My second comment is, how would you define how does the feminist movement look to you today? Do you think the foremothers that you mentioned, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and so many others, would approve of how the feminist movement is going? Because over the years, they've had some crazy ideas, and I don't think that's what they were talking about. Thank you.
Yeah, so absolutely. To your point, I mean, there was the whole Stop ERA movement that was spearheaded primarily by women. You know, there's historically some of the loudest and most the strongest and opponents, I guess, of women's rights have been women. And so yes, absolutely. And navigating that is a painful exercise to me personally. To your point about how I think that kind of some of the foremothers of the movement might evaluate things today. There were undeniably racist leaders in the suffrage movement who would probably not be super thrilled with how the current iteration of the women's movement focuses on inclusion and intersectionality. And that is history, but it's also informing how we approach how the women's movement approaches teaching about history today too. And you know, it's another reason too that a project of the academic side, the women's and gender studies side of this is going back and saying, okay, who were the people who were doing work who did not make it into the books, who did not make it into the history books, in, back then, and let's, work on expanding the canon of who we consider the foremothers of the movement.
Okay. All right. So we're down to our last three questions. We got Penn Center, and then in the chat, we've got Cecil and Christine. Then we'll go to Dr. Madden's presentation. So Penn Center, go ahead, please.
Good evening. As you were talking about the women's movement and how women have been challenged and underrated and masquerading along with tradition, I thought about Fannie Lou Hamer. A lot of times, these women didn't have a voice, but they also didn't have a representative that they can go to for medical reasons or concerns. And when they did go, they were mistreated, misdiagnosed, and found themselves in a pitfall of other things that would carry over. So that was one of my concerns, one of my statements, is I thought about her. And so if you can give me some examples of some other challenges, I think you mentioned one or two that challenged women masquerading as tradition. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great call. And yeah, so I think access to healthcare, and there's a very clear through line there to today where the maternal mortality rates in South Carolina are just insane. We know that it's rooted in for the most part in the intersection of racism and sexism, and how women aren't listened to in many medical spaces. Other examples of challenges rooted in kind of the stronghold of tradition. I'm sorry, on the spot. Many issues related to equal pay. There is the tradition of the family wage, the idea that men who are working, and this is true nationally and in South Carolina as well, if a man is holding a job, then he's having that job, earning money to support his family. Whereas if a woman is holding the job, she's doing it for one of the quotes I was reading from the 70s talked about earning pin money, right? That the money that she was earning from her job was not to support her family, but rather to, for, trivial things or to support herself as a single woman. And so kind of using that as justification for pay inequality. Kind of the tradition of men, serving in these provider roles as opposed to kind of rejecting that or stepping back from that tradition.
Here, like usually one of the things that it's masquerade through tradition is to assign to women like the care tasks at home and also in the public space, because we think that it's natural for women like to be careful.
Exactly.
But in reality is something that we are like raised up like to be on care of the rest, because men are strong, but women are careful and affectionate and emotional. So they assign the role to women to be the ones that have to create a family and to be the ones that educate the kids, or if you have like people that are dependent, they are the ones that have the knowledge to know how to care of the dependents.
Absolutely. And we start doing that by defining what girls' toys and boys' toys are, right? And from birth, where and not they're not enforced like equally, in different families enforce them in different ways, but they're in different aisles at Target, you know. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so we have time for 2 more questions. No, there are more questions in the chat. We'll try to come back to them if we have time at the end of class, but Cecil, go ahead and make your statement and question right away.
Well, I kind of wanted her permission to quote from a paper that she wrote. Let me see here. I'm sorry, just give me a moment. So concerning this third movement of the women's movement, specifically that it rejected the idea that women are a monolith, I wanted to quote from a paper you wrote in 2011 with Laura Oliver. And you said, the women's vote is increasingly becoming a dominant force and concern in presidential electoral politics. Not only is it clear that women vote differently than men, basing their decisions on different factors, but it's also apparent that as current trends continue and women enter the voting population at an ever-increasing rate, this disparity should grow. It is also clear, you said, however, that Democratic Party cannot take women's votes for granted, as was demonstrated in 2004. So my question is, has that disparity grown over the last 20 years, as you theorized? And if so, could it help explain the drop of 5 points from Biden's support by women voters to those earned by Harris in 2024?
Yeah, so we're absolutely still, you know, answering questions from this past election round. And I think that so women continually outvote men in presidential elections. And on average, there are claims that we can make about how women vote on average. But something that has become more and more apparent with each passing election is that this gender gap in voting behavior is largely driven by women of color. And I think, you know, with every election, this is, I mean, the data support this more and more. So I think that there are claims and analyses of electoral behavior that we could make 15 years ago that we have to look at differently now, as the picture has fully unfolded. Women of color, and particularly Black women, are the most reliable demographic when it comes to voting turnout, as well as the most consistent in terms of candidate or in party preference. And so much of what we've seen historically in terms of gender gap and party preference has been driven by Black women. And I think that underestimating or under deprioritizing that fact, in my estimation, explains some of the drop off that we've seen in recent elections. I don't know if that answers, but
Yeah, that's great. And thank you for a really great presentation.
thank you.
Okay, our last question for Dr. Madden, to Christine in the chat. What do you think about the arguments Marxists make against identity politics, namely that identity politics play into the idea of divide and conquer amongst different groups?
I think that it is I think we can think about things at a theoretical level. I think about things at a practical level. Bless you. And at a practical level, it's very difficult to divorce ourselves from our identities and how we move through the world. And I think just personally, that when we step away from identity politics, then we can be doing a disservice to the very real experiences that people have in navigating the institutions and systems that kind of drive our lives. And so I understand the concern. And I understand that, when we talk about different kinds of identity, it can, be divisive, but I think it's one of the reasons that this concept of intersectionality is so useful. Because intersectionality both highlights, like I said, the unique positions that people experience life in based on who they are from a gender, race, class, sexuality, religion, ethnicity, immigration status, what have you, based on all of these multitudes of identities. But it also, if we think about it as an analytical tool, then it also helps us figure out, okay, where are the through lines? Where are the connections? Yes, I'm made up of these various identities, and the gender identity in me sees the gender identity in you, and the class identity in me sees the class identity in you. And I think that concept is a particularly useful way to approach identity politics. In my estimation.
Absolutely. And of course, if you're talking about Marxist theory and identity politics, you'll talk to 10 Marxists and get 10 very different ideas about what that could be. But again, on the other hand, round of applause for Annie here. Another important part of tonight's presentation.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be here. I appreciate you all so much.
Thanks for that.
Thank you.
That's great.
Yes.
Got an important announcement to make, and tell Quinn that we'll get to the question. I wanted to, we're bringing Dr. Madden up. Dr. Madden's been with us for many years, and he was a board member of the Progressive Network. He's a tenured professor at the University of South Carolina. I want to announce that Dr. Green received his tenure. That's our subtle hand of getting me in frame. Dr. Green received his tenure just recently. This weekend, Dr. Green?
Friday.
Friday.
Yay!
I would do t-shirts and everything because tenure should give him some standing that he actually deserves, but he chose Claflin to be here in South Carolina teaching at HBCU as opposed to a state university where Ed got his tenure before they bounced people out like that. And we have a cake. This congratulations for Dr. Green. Do not make him eat it all.
Okay.
But I digress. Excuse me, Dr. Madden.
Oh, no, that's great. Congratulations.
Oh, I'm supposed to sing for he's a jolly good fellow, for he's a jolly good fellow, for he's a jolly good fellow.
Nobody can deny.
I just want to make one thing clear to folks on Zoom. I had nothing to do with that singing a moment ago. Nothing to do with that.
It's difficult to sneak up on Dr. Green. I mean,
Okay. There we go. I loved what Annie said. I wrote it down because I thought you said it so nicely. Just because we don't know what their stories are doesn't mean those stories don't exist. And I think that's particularly true for gay and lesbian people, queer people, trans people of all kinds. I want to start with this. I have a presentation. I'm working on a history of queer Columbia. And then the work I've done with Historic Columbia and with the archives at USC, we came across this story. This is from August 27th, 1922. It is in Columbia. Officers hold strange Negro, physicians to examine female impersonator. Richard Watson, robust Negro attired in women's clothing, stood before Councilman Dupree yesterday in the city court, center of all eyes. Richard had been known and recognized as Rachel Watson in Columbia Homes, where he cooked and did other housework. And I feel on the one hand, I feel really awkward showing the image because it is a prison photo. On the other hand, it is our only documentation of her, except for these stories, the stories which stigmatize her in so many ways. Rachel Watson was an amazing person. Rachel Watson was kicked out of Columbia in 1922. She was charged with disorderly conduct. That was the law that they used back then for people who dressed in clothes that were inappropriate to their gender, to their sex. She was kicked out of town. They didn't, the fine would have been 30 days in jail. Instead, they put her on a bus out of town and sent her back toward Virginia, where she originally came from. 1927, she's arrested again in Batesburg, again working as a household, a maid or cook of some kind. 1930, she's arrested in Columbia again. And at this point, she's a nurse known as Auntie Watson, and everybody thought she was an amazing nurse. The interesting thing, so I wanted to start with this just to raise 4 fundamental issues. The first one is the question of evidence. Like, how do we determine the history of queer people when there was so much shame and stigma and legal prosecution against this, that the stories simply don't exist? What evidence is there other than frequently court documents? That's what we have, or laws that are criminalizing forms of behavior. The second thing the reason I want to start with this is to say this is not something new. Despite the fact that our fucking administration, sorry, but I got the F word in there early. Despite this administration acting like trans is this new horrible fad, trans people have always been here. They just expressed themselves in different ways and had access to different forms of care and different forms of visibility. The third reason I want to bring this up is because this tells us from the beginning, sexuality is always complicated by race and class. Not a single one of the white people she worked for recognized that she was trans. They didn't see her. She was household help. She took care of the kids. She was in the kitchen. But the women she went to church with knew. And in fact, it was a fellow woman who turned her in. So it shows us that class and race matter in the ways that are fundamental to her autonomy, because within that space, she was not seen. The fourth reason I want to bring that up is for the question of autonomy. We slightly changed the title this year for this class. I wanted to add autonomy because I think that's one of the things that connects Annie's presentation on gender and my presentation on sexuality, is that these are questions about what autonomy do we have? I teach a course at USC on Introduction to Queer Studies, and I've done it a couple times as a coming of age class. And doing it as a coming of age class, we read texts where we think about, when did you know? What did you know? What information did you have access to? Who provided that information? Where did you get it? And I think those questions matter now if we think about the book banners who don't want people to read books about queer people or Black people. Anyways, and I love the sort of children's book mantra that books are both windows and mirrors. They're mirrors because they allow us to see ourselves in ways we hadn't been able to see ourselves, but they're also windows because they allow us to experience the experiences of other people. And I love that simple visual metaphor for thinking about what books can do. But autonomy extends beyond what we know to what we can do with our own bodies. What autonomy, what control do I have over my own body? What control do I have over my own intimate relationships? And what control do I have over my own family? And I'm going to come back to that. I want to put this in context very quickly, just to think about where we are. This is 1922. At this point, sodomy laws were still in force in South Carolina. You should know that we were the last state in the nation to remove sodomy, remove the death penalty from sodomy laws. That was in 1869. 1872, after the Civil War, the laws were erased. They rewrote them, but they forgot to put in a law for sodomy. And I should say too, the South Carolina retains the Old English word buggery. We're the only state in the nation that does that. Most states use the word sodomy, and in fact, most states bothered to go ahead and write laws that were clear about what they applied to. Not us. Let's keep it ambiguous. So it was a buggery law. 1872, they rewrote it, and the penalty was 5 years and or $500 fine. Now, compared to other states that had penalties of up to 20 and 30 years, that may seem light, but those states with 20 and 30 years, the judge had discretion. There was no discretion here. It was a mandatory 5 years. So ours, despite seeming less punitive, was actually one of the strictest ones in the nation. And in 1895, we convicted people who were convicted of sodomy were banned from voting. That did not change till 1993. And you should know too that it's still on the books. Even though Lawrence versus Texas and the Supreme Court case of 2003 makes it unenforceable, it's still there. And it technically applies to straight people as well. So technically, straight people who have oral sex should go to jail for 5 years and pay a $500 fine. But it's not enforced that way. And in fact, when I moved here in South Carolina, they were saying it wasn't enforced at all. It was enforced in two ways. One was in the courts of public opinion and policy over and over again when the university tried to change things, when hate crimes laws when people proposed hate crimes laws, when people tried to get partner benefits at USC, when the USC student group tried to form, they were told that these things couldn't happen because of the sodomy law, because it would be to encourage a felony. The other place, though it was enforced, we found out when we did the research before Lawrence versus Texas, was in the prisons. So it was enforced disproportionately. They used it in prisons. We found 28 cases, and I forget the years. I'm sorry, I apologize for that, but it was around 2002 we were doing the research, but we found 28 cases in prisons, and it was used actually because of the third strike law. So it was a way of getting a third strike on someone to keep them in jail longer.
Wow.
So that's how it was enforced. One other thing I think we should think about, just think about the ways let me give you a little more context. I think we should also think about the ways people organize their intimate lives at this point. So we have to think about what do we know and what do we not know. I actually think a wonderful example of this is Laura Town and Ellen Murray. I'm saying that right? The women who founded the Penn Center, who were devoted partners for 40 years. We don't know if they were lesbians. What we do know is that in the 19th century, unmarried women who were middle class and had jobs formed romantic friendships, formed Boston marriages, and that was the space within which romantic, affectionate, or sexual relationships were formed. So this is that space, and it's a space within which we can't say what we know, but we do know that the women who founded the Penn Center were in fact in a romantic friendship that lasted for 40 years. It was a different way of organizing your intimate life and your family life in the 19th century. I wanted to add one other thing about the context here. Our law was a disorderly conduct law. Charleston had a law about appearing in public in clothes or manner not becoming your sex. It was passed after the Civil War. There were a wave of these laws in the late 19th century across the nation. Here, though, it came with a particular South Carolina variance. It was passed in 1868. It suggests concerns about gender and sexual identity all over the nation. But here, we already had laws about clothing. If you were a white person, you could confiscate clothing that you considered too extravagant on an enslaved person. That's from 1735. It was still in force in the 19th century. 1795, Charleston passed a law that an enslaved person or a free person of color could not wear a disguise. So we were already in a context in Charleston and in South Carolina within which clothing was a way of enforcing the social order. So if we want to think about this as an anti-cross-dressing law, we could, but I think we have to think about it in the larger context within which clothes were used to enforce power and enforce the existing social order of the time. There were other examples. There was 1859, there was a Charleston, I want to say trans person now, lived mostly as a woman. Caroline Wilson was arrested. Was accused of being a possible abolitionist as well. So again, thinking of the intersections of these things, because she was seen talking to people of color, so she must be an abolitionist. Was shipped off to New York right before South Carolina seceded. Lucky her. And then 1871, George Robinson, who was a young black man, was arrested in Charleston for breaking this law and put in jail for 30 days and reappeared later in Savannah. So I just wanted to start with that because for me, it raises so many important issues about this. I'm going to I did want to flag for you as well before I go any further, that if you are interested in Columbia, South Carolina history, Historic Columbia has a great website, LGBTQ Columbia History Initiative, and it has some wonderful things, including oral histories, Columbia's LGBTQ stories, Gay history of the University of South Carolina, which to me is fascinating because we find out from oral histories there was a purge of 50-something gay men from the university in the late 50s. It's not thinking about what do we know and what do we not know. It's not documented in any records. The university historian has tried to find it, and we can't find anything, but it exists in oral histories. Men who went to USC in the 50s who reported men who had been evicted because they were gay. Also this wonderful piece on female impersonators in Columbia at the time. In the
Was that part of the Lavender Scare with the communism thing that was going on in the 50s?
I don't know, it could have been, I would say it was adjacent. It might not have been adjacent to it. But what I want to do now, and I'm just going to apologize. I'm plagiarizing myself. I had to give a presentation to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I thought I could rewrite this all for you, but I'm just going to kind of go through it if that's okay. The U.S. Attorney's Office had a program for Pride, and they asked me to give some kind of presentation about LGBTQ rights. And so I did a presentation I called Who's We? Thinking about it, and I redid it for Iris, the student group, last fall at USC. Just a little context about it. It was a presentation from the U.S. Attorney's Office, but I'm going to begin with a phone call from my mother, so we can think a little bit about scale, and the personal is political as well. I'm thinking about the politics of belonging, the relation of the me to the we, which we might think is the relation of the personal to the political. I'm not going to do the video clips or the wonky academic slides, but I am going to do 7 moments from South Carolina history that are part of the struggle of defining who we are as queer folks. So 7 specific moments, mostly Columbia, but not all Columbia. So in 2016, my new book was out. I wanted to go home and take a bunch of footage from rural Arkansas. A friend of mine who's a filmmaker wanted to go with me. There was a book about taking care of my dad who had been dying of cancer. Called my mom, said, "Can we stay with you?" She said, "Who's we?" And immediately I knew what she was asking. Was my husband of 20 years going to be with me? It's now 30 years. My mother and brother have refused to meet him for 30 years. So when we think about the personal and the political and the relation between, how did you put it, personal experience and social transformation, I think for gay people, we feel this in very specific ways, because for us, often the experiences of discrimination and silence and stigma and harm begin in the most intimate community of all, the family. And so it's hard for us to think about what are the parameters, what are the costs, what are the things we have to do to fit in the we, if we have learned from the beginning that fitting in the we is always at the cost of something about ourselves. Okay. So for me, that was just that question rings in so many useful ways for me, thinking about this. I was also thinking about we the people and the preamble. When I did this with the lawyers, we did you probably know the schoolhouse walk thing. We the people. I'm not going to do that to you. It's great fun. Why is it not going for? Oh yeah. And then also there's a great episode on the 14th Amendment. On PBS. I will say, I always teach this. I teach a seminar on sexuality and justice, looking at Supreme Court cases alongside literature and film. I've always shown this little episode, Created Equal, about the 14th Amendment and citizenship, and it interviews people who are migrants and people who are queer. The queer people saying, I don't really fit in the we the people as long as I can't get married to my wife, but lots about migrants. I assigned this at the beginning of the semester when I had to be at a conference thinking, oh, this is the old historical stuff I always do. This will be the perfect thing. I do it every year, every time I teach this class. And what happened? Donald Trump decided birthright citizenship didn't exist. And so suddenly I had to add a question to our homework. Google the 14th Amendment right now and see how it's in the news. So things we think are established in this nation right now are never established. I'm gonna skip the academic wonky stuff. I did this with, I think we the people, we is an interesting way of constantly affirming who we are as an American community and thinking about who fits. These all were coming out around 2006, and then again in 2023, I think 2023 was when I started collecting these. It became a gay thing to say we the people means everyone. So with the rainbow flag or the really, really creepy rainbow guy hugging. But I'm going to do these moments from South Carolina history. And all of them, I think about ways of thinking of defining who we are as queer people in South Carolina. And I want to start with this one. This is the Candlestick Murders, October 1958. On Halloween, October 31st, 1958, an 18-year-old airman from Charleston Air Force Base, John Mahon, brutally bludgeoned a gay man to death. The gay man, 30-year-old Jack Dobbins, they were in his home after an evening of bar hopping together. They met at Club 49, which was a mixed bar in Charleston at the time. The front of the bar would be mixed, and then the back room of the bar would be where the gays and lesbians would go. There were no actual gay or lesbian bars at the time. They had been bar hopping together. Mahon was wearing a leather jacket and jeans. He knew what he was doing. When they got to his house, Jack Dobbins disrobed and was lying on the couch, and Mahon came up behind him with the candlestick he picked up in the house and bludgeoned him to death. There were no defensive wounds. It was just all bashed in the back of his head. The trial was in December, quickly, October 31st to December 1958. The defense claimed that Mahon was scared for his virginity, that he had claimed self-defense, that Dobbins had made improper advances. The court of public opinion and the newspapers quickly put Dobbins, not Mahon, on trial, making him not the victim, but the criminal himself. He was a dangerous predator. They completely ignored the fact that he was a Korean War veteran, but talked about his lavender bed sheets and his flair for artistic home furnishings. It was the first use of the gay panic defense in the nation. So gay panic defense is when you're so temporarily, when you are a straight man, if a gay man comes onto you, you are temporarily insane. And if you kill him, you're totally excused for temporary insanity. This was the first use of it in the nation. You may or may not remember that when Matthew Shepard was killed, his two killers, the judge explicitly forbade their defense lawyers from using a gay panic defense. But this was the first use. It was a court, an MA student in public history, Santi Thompson at USC, wrote his master's thesis on this and talks about the real silence and stigma around this case. Real silence except for one moment. Harlan Green tells us that when the verdict was announced, which cleared Mahon of any crime, the crowd in the courtroom erupted into applause. So that's 1958, and clearly we're not part of the we. We're silent. We are silenced, and you could say it's maybe not when the gay panic defense isn't an implicit license to kill. No, I'll rephrase that. It's not an explicit license to kill, but it is absolutely an implicit license to kill. The next moment, marriage of Don Langley Hall to John Paul Simmons, January 1969. This, again, we have to think about intersectional identities. Gordon Langley Hall, the dead name, Gordon's name at birth. He was born in England, 1922, sometimes considered trans, later insisted herself that she was born intersex, had been raised male but was female. Author of biographies of royal and historical figures. 1968, had transition surgery at Johns Hopkins, became Dawn. January 21st, 1969, married her butler and mechanic, John Paul Simmons. In the wake of the 1968 Loving versus Virginia, this actually was one of the most well-known interracial marriages in the nation, I think because of the extra charge that it was South Carolina, and that it was a trans person getting married. She used the battle hymn of the Republic as her wedding march. Charleston society had adored her as long as she was British, right, Anglophiles, and as long as she was writing biographies. And they tolerated the gender transition, but they absolutely rejected the interracial marriage. There were bomb threats to the church, so they had to hold the marriage in her home. The crate of wedding gifts that had been delivered from her family in Britain was firebombed in the street, and she and her entourage were forced to clean up the mess. And historian Jim Sears says that when the Charleston paper ran the wedding announcement, they specifically put it on the obituary page, which I think is a nice way of saying this is a form of social death, even if it's not a real death. And I think this is just a reminder for us of the ways that identity, not just sexual identity, but class identity, racial identity, but also power and privilege inflect LGBTQ identities and communities. Next, and if you read the stuff in the folder, you read about this, the founding of South Carolina PFLAG, 1982. And I put here the questions that belong here are always questions of scale. And again, I think of my own family and my own mother here. One of the things we might think about is something Jim Sears says, is that before you can get people to organize politically, you got to get them together socially. So the growth of bar culture, the growth of drag shows, the creation of many short-lived local gay groups in the 1970s, but this would become the first LGBTQ rights organization in the state, and it's founded by Harriet Hancock, who was a straight woman whose son had come out to her as gay. And she was worried about the climate and the culture that he would face. It was actually funny, if you knew her son, she was actually more out than her son was in many ways. He moved off to Atlanta, so he didn't have to deal with what was going on here. But she was amazing. She's a hero. So you have the little booklet that Becky wrote in your section. She's also, when they did City of Women, when Historic Columbia did their City of Women, she was one of the women they chose for that first series. This is 1982. It's the same year that the student group requested to be formed at USC. USC, of course, denied it because it would support a felony. But the federal court here ruled against it. And so they formed. I'm trying to see if there anything. The other sort of context things here we might think about. 1986 was the Supreme Court's Bowers versus Hardwick case, which ruled that states didn't, that people did not have a right to sodomy, to use their phrase, but basically that states could have sodomy laws against gay and lesbian people. 1985, Palmetto AIDS Life Support Services is founded. It's the first AIDS service organization, was founded here in this state. Here in this city, and Harriet was one of the co-founders of that organization. 1987, thinking about family still, Stroman versus Williams. It was a case here in Columbia that said that homosexuality does not render a parent unfit. So again, thinking about the kind of context of family, this was a moment where South Carolina actually was a little more progressive than a lot of other Southern states. That homosexuality per se was not grounds for ruling a parent unfit. And then 1988, we'll come back to this, the Comprehensive Health Education Act passed, which said there could be no discussion of homosexuality except in the context of disease prevention, which brings us to AIDS. April 20th, 1989, ACT UP demonstrates in Columbia. And this is the moment, this is the tipping point for our community, the first major tipping point, I would say, for our community in this state. Belonging has to be oppositional, it has to be resistant, and it has to be organized. This is a photo I put by Diana. Diana is from the South Carolina LGBTQ history collection at USC. Diana is an amazing African-American activist who she founded an early AIDS action group called AIDS Busters. It was kids who met in her hair salon and would go out to communities and pass out condoms and do AIDS education. So she's amazing. She has a autobiography as well, which we have in the library. Anyway, a bunch of activists, ACT UP activists, mostly from Atlanta, some from New York, and then activists from here in South Carolina, on a Thursday at noon, protested in front of our State House. They held a kiss-in and did the march around the State House, the kiss-in to demonstrate that AIDS is not passed by casual contact. And then they went out and died in the street. It was a what do you call that? A die-in. They had a die-in in the street right there at the intersection of Main Street and Gervais at noon on a Thursday.
Yes.
Wow. Sometimes you just miss that kind of activism, don't you? 41 people were arrested.
For dying.
I'm sorry?
For dying. For dying.
Yeah,
in the street.
for dying in the street. Yeah. I think, 41.
I'm just saying.
Yeah, okay.
The numbers.
Yeah. It was one of the first, this was one of the first direct action protests by ACT UP outside of the major centers of San Francisco, New York, Washington, D.C. So Columbia was targeted, and we were targeted because our legislature was considering a law that would have quarantined people who were found to be HIV positive. It didn't pass, but that's the reason this action happened here. It's a turning point for visibility. It's a turning point for growing politicization. That was in May. Later that fall, 1989, there was a private family picnic at a park here in town. And Harriet Hancock and some others went around with a clipboards to get people to sign up for a Pride March. And so the first Pride March was held the next year. So you can see how AIDS itself, but also ACT UP activism related to AIDS was really a foundational tipping point for LGBTQ work. I wanted to read one thing from this. So of the of the national organizations there, are the activists not from Columbia there. Some people from New York were there, and David Levitt, the writer, wrote a story about it in the New York Times. And I just want to read what he said. You may have read it if you read my Proud Heritage piece, but I just find this so moving. Afterward, when everyone was bailed out and we were sitting in a motel room watching the television coverage and listening to the radio, we heard an interview with one of the few native Carolinians who had taken part in the protest. He was wearing a hospital mask, he explained to the interviewer, which he had taken from the room of the first friend of his who had died of AIDS. And he had put a silence equals death button on that mask to show that he was protesting on behalf of those friends who had died as well as for himself. At the end of the interview, the reporter asked him if he wanted to say who he was. He hesitated, explaining that coming out was something one had to do one step at a time. He paused, then he said his name and the town where he lived. And what Levitt goes on to say was that the visiting activists that's sitting in their hotel room did not expect him to give his name, but instead he had spoken out, branded himself, gone public. Too many people in his life had died brutal deaths for him to ever be silent again. So the next moment is that first Pride, June 23rd, 1990. And I like to think this is the moment of we too. This is our house too. And by the way, so it's a claim for inclusion against past exclusions. We had pink balloons. We walked down Main Street. We were supposed to stop at the State House for the big rally. People were so emotional, they rushed the steps. And I love this symbolically because it wasn't planned, but it's a way of saying this is our house too. And notably, we didn't break windows and steal office furniture and all that kind of stuff. But we still said it was our house. It took place on June 23rd, 1990. It's a moment where I think we began to imagine our society as different. It's not that we were imagining ourselves as a community, but we were imagining the possibility of a different kind of society. If this is our house too, we're imagining a different kind of South Carolina. I ended there with the Department of Justice, and one of them told me, oh, this is too hopeful. I had written in my notes, we lifted our banners and our pink balloons and our hearts and our hopes. It was really overdone. And someone said, this is just too hopeful. And I thought, you're right. So, positive side, 1993, First Community Center, 1993, South Carolina Gay and Lesbian Business Guild forms, 1995, We Are Families established in Charleston, 1996, South Carolina passes the Defense of Marriage Act, 1996, Greenville passes a county resolution that says homosexuality is incompatible with community standards, 2002, South Carolina Equality Coalition forms, 2003, Lawrence versus Texas passed, which overturned Bowers versus Hardwick. Suddenly, you're no longer a potential felon if you're a gay person. 2004, Dunbar versus Foot Locker. If you don't know this, one of the most important cases in employment history around LGBTQ people before the Bostock decision was a case here in Columbia. It was a young Black gay man who worked in 2 Foot Locker stores who was subjected to such intense anti-gay harassment by his co-workers that 3 customers complained. When he then went to complain, he was fired. So he sued. They settled out of court. So there's nothing beyond the complaint. But the really cool thing is that when I was teaching, I taught this case in one of my intro to queer studies classes, and one of my students worked for Foot Locker. And he told the whole class, it was just like one of those moments. He said that when he went through the diversity training for Foot Locker, that case was where the booklet starts. So it's now part of their own diversity training. It's telling the story of what happened. 2005 and 2006. I'm going to think of this as a major tipping point as well. Rainbow Radio was founded in 2005. We had the first public outreach at the state fair in the fall of 2005. 2006 was the first South Carolina Black Gay Pride. What was happening was 2006, we were about to have the marriage amendment, the Amendment 1 on the ballot. And so we knew that everybody's going to be talking about us. We knew that even if we didn't think marriage was a priority for our community, everybody was going to be talking about marriage. And so it was important for us to be part of the conversation. I think that's why we founded Rainbow Radio and why there was such a move toward visibility. I was on the board of the South Carolina Gay and Lesbian Pride Movement. We put this ad, We the People, includes everyone. In 2006, we proposed it to a magazine here in Columbia. I won't name the magazine. I'll just say it wasn't Jasper and it wasn't Fig. we put that in and we didn't put the words gay or lesbian in it. We just used that little rainbow flag because people know what that signal does, what it means. They turned it down. The official reason, I wrote that it was deemed unacceptable for publication. And when we wrote a letter asking for an explanation, we never received a reply.
Is that their marking, Ed? That's what they said?
No, that's just me.
Oh, okay.
No, we just got a letter saying it was unacceptable for publication.
Okay.
That was it, and that was the last communication they had with us. And what was it? Just later that year, 78% of the voters in this state passed the Amendment 1, which prohibited recognition of same-sex marriages and civil unions and any recognition. 78%. Although there were lovely, I'm sorry, Columbia was like, when you see pictures of ground zero at a bomb, right? Columbia, when you looked, it was like strong. Like Columbia was good, Charleston was good, part of Hilton Head was good. So there were areas in the state that when you look at the voter maps, there was a really strong opposition to the amendment. I think this connects with one of the things, oh God, I'm conscious of time, say 15. One of the things you said, it connects when people were thought the feminist movement was something from out of state, something from the North. The same thing was happening at this moment repeatedly when you heard legislators talk about gay marriage. This is a right from somewhere else. It's those liberals in Massachusetts. So we started doing the work. Among the work we did was looking at the 2000 census. We were 3rd and 4th in the nation for families and Black families raising gay and lesbian families and Black families raising kids. Black same-sex couples in 2000 were almost as likely, it was like 61 to 67%, almost as likely to be raising kids as Black straight couples. So family was part of who we were. Yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, sorry. But I wanted to connect back to Annie's talk there. 2006 were included in the South Carolina Encyclopedia, even though we had to fight to do so. 2009 was the first upstate Pride March, and 2010 was the first Charleston Pride March. Do one other thing. Gender and Sexuality Alliance versus Spearman, a consent decree, March 11, 2020. This flew by all of us because it was in the middle of the shutdown. But that 1988 law that said you couldn't talk about homosexuality except in the context of disease prevention, number one, it only applied to the mandatory hours of sex education, but it was repeatedly used by school officials to keep kids from talking about homosexuality. Rock Hill until in 2012, the kids were doing debates for the presidential election. They wanted to do same-sex marriage. He said, no, according to the principal, said, no, according to the 1988 Comprehensive Health Education Act, you can't talk about it except, so he shut it down. So over and over again, it would be used as a way of silencing conversations about homosexuality. In 1995, a Union County health ed teacher was put on probation for showing the film Philadelphia. She wanted to talk to a health ed class about terminal illness and AIDS. They put her on probation and cited the 1988 law. 2014, we might remember that Out Loud, a book of essays from the Rainbow Radio, and Fun Home, the graphic novel, were both attacked at USC and at College of Charleston. So this 2020 decree was really important because basically the Attorney General, Alan Wilson, agreed that law was unconstitutional in terms of equal protection because gay and lesbian kids were not getting an adequate sex education. So he just agreed that it was no longer enforceable. It's a consent decree based on the Equal Protection Clause. Although obviously we could say that the questions who can know what, who can say, and what books exist, and curriculum debates, those are all still going on. I wanted to end with just a couple of other quick things. I wanted to note that right now, at this very moment, Scarametti is before the Supreme Court, U.S. versus Scarametti. This is a case, Tennessee has a ban on gender affirming care for minors, and it's being pursued on the equal protection case because the very same therapies that can be prescribed to cis youth for various things, premature puberty, birth defects, all sorts of things, is denied to kids, to trans kids. And so that's the court case, that they should be able to get the same treatments as other minors under equal protection. But we will see what happens. This is a case that if they decide that trans people are a suspect class, they have to rule against Tennessee. If they decide it just as rational basis, and sometimes the government has a reason for doing things, rational reasons for discriminating, then they're likely to uphold the Tennessee law, and it will probably come out this summer sometime. I'll stop here. Just this question, when you look at the political legal landscape now, is who's we? I think we can think about the ways in which trans people are being erased, and let's use that term. Trump saying you can't have a trans passport, Texas saying you can't change your gender on your driver's license, various states saying you can't have gender affirming care even up into adulthood. These are ways of erasing trans people. What stories do we tell? What stories do we silence? Blah, blah, blah. I'll stop there. I know I'm gone. It's 8:20. I need to stop.
Any questions? Any questions at all?
Let me add something, and just Dr. Madden's concurrence, at least in some aspect, that important, I think, to lift up that one of the first safe above ground spaces for gay activists was GROW. We had GROW staff people in '78. We worked with a group leading up to the Harriet Sunbreak coming out and working with PFLAG. PFLAG was one of the founding members of the network. So we've been there all the time, and I'm not saying that for myself, but just to let people know that we've been holding down this side of reality, equality.
And I would add to that, Progressive Network was the first progressive network, if I remember accurately, in the nation to include sexual orientation. There were lots of networks of activist groups doing feminist, abortion, labor unions, civil rights, all these things. But the others, like in Missouri, didn't want the gay people there because they thought it would be too divisive.
That is something we didn't get time to get into this class about within, say, the NOW. There were two separate NOWs that split over the lesbian question.
Yeah.
And there was one meeting in GROW, and then there was like a hoo-ha, and part of them went to Midlands now, and I mean, but that's important that we carry on that discussion as we talk about the internal divisions, focusing on that, which is we call silos.
Yeah.
Gabby, you have a question?
Yeah, I just have a comment to add to what you were saying about the Comprehensive Health Education Act of 1988. I put it in the chat, but right now happening Lexington Richland 5, they have pulled a children's book about tennis star Billie Jean King because it had a single line about the fact that she married a woman, and they are citing this law as the reason to pull it. They did not ask parents, they did not consult the board, they just pulled it from the shelf. So unfortunately,
Did no one tell them that they cannot use that law?
well,
It's
they-
not enforceable.
Exactly.
Alan Wilson said so.
well, right, well, they are finding out because they are going to be sued.
Excellent.
Some friends.
Excellent. And you know, the crazy thing about that is how many gay and lesbian kids are in that school, or how many kids with gay and lesbian parents
Exactly.
who would simply say, oh, like, see themselves. This is a mirror, right?
Yep.
Just over that one line. And so they act like first of all, they act like there are no queer kids in our schools. Second, they don't think about the fact, how many of those kids have queer parents, queer uncles and aunts,
Right.
right? And so by erasing that representation, they're not just affecting the kids,
Right.
they're affecting kids with parents, they're affecting the families of those kids. It's just an idiotic move. Yeah, I'm glad they're being sued.
And by the way, it's gonna be the first time you hear in this building the phrase said, you gotta hand to Alan Wilson about something.
Wilson, who's like
But-
going up
Yeah.
to the city court.
Yeah, he might have done it differently now because, he's running for governor, so he's got to bash the gay people. If you've lived in South Carolina long enough, you know that this happens when people start running for higher office, when a state or national election is coming up. The gay people are the easy targets over and over.
All right, from Zoom, we've got Cecil and then Taisha. Cecil, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Madden. One of the readings for our class is a PDF containing your remarks that were made at a 20,720 Women's Studies Community Panel to address the 2006 Fairness for All Families campaign. Could you tell us what that campaign was about related to the issues you've talked about tonight? And could you or Brett tell us what you remember Nelson Rivers saying during that panel?
Yeah, so it was.
Democracy Day.
Well, so first of all, the larger context, this was for about Amendment 1, the amendment to prohibit recognition of same-sex marriages, domestic partnerships, any kind of civil union, any kind of recognition at all. So that was our campaign slogan, fairness for all families. And I talked a little bit about that. But yes, Nelson Rivers spoke at Democracy Day, which Progressive Network co-sponsored with the NAACP. And he asked, do you remember what Nelson Rivers said at that event?
Well, we were talking about equality means equal. And there were different degrees of equality. I don't know what he said, but we've got the poster we printed. I'll share with people later.
Okay.
It was a good crowd. We spent a lot of time and effort on it, but it's just indicative of where we live.
Yeah.
Where we live.
But I used it in that paper to talk about the ways in which we were in the second wave. 2004 presidential election, most of the states had this on their ballot. We were lucky. Honestly, we're often lucky because we're behind the other really rabid states by 2 or 4 years. But this was our attempt to intervene in the ways that other states, the right wing, had used homophobia, had tried to deploy homophobia within the Black community to affect the vote. And it was our attempt to diffuse that from the get-go because we knew it was going to come in this state for sure. So that was Cecil. That was the context. I hope I answered your question. That paper, I reread it this afternoon and it embarrassed me. There's one sentence in there I would never write now. And I'll just say what it was. It was the question about we included migrants, attention to migrant issues. And I said I thought that was at the time an unwise decision. And now I just think, God, we should have done more with that at this point.
Well, thank you.
And before we move on, I just really want to underline what I thought was one of the network's finest decisions and finest moments. And that was at the founding conference at Penn Center when we spent a lot of time. I mean, it was a weekend thing, but we spent the bulk of that time trying to decide how widely we wanted to cast the net. And there was a contingent that wanted to keep things simple and clean, like most of these kind of network organizations were, that they were labor specific or really oriented toward one specific demographic. And we chose with great risk to open it up to anybody who agreed with our mission statement. And that did, as you're talking about, Dr. Madden, include, sexual orientation as well as reproductive rights. Both of those issues we knew was going to attract, make potential allies nervous and also kind of maybe restrict some funding options. So we went in it with a wide-eyed, not being naive kumbaya, but it was like a really deliberative, intentional decision. And I'm thinking it's one of the best decisions that we ever made, because upon that sense of trust and inclusiveness, the whole foundation and purpose and sense of the direction of the organization was set. And it was like, as long as you've got our back, we've got yours. And I think it served us really well.
I think that's great, Becky. And I love how the South Carolina Progressive Network sometimes is very under the radar, but doing effective work. Thank you for saying that.
All right, Taisha, go ahead, please.
So good afternoon, well, good evening. Thank you for the lesson. So I am a native New Yorker. So you never mentioned anything about Stonewall, but one thing interesting about Stonewall is the trans people wasn't really considered part of the gay and lesbian movement. That's number one. Number two, contrary to what people believe, and South Carolina act like they are so goody, so conservative. Because as a New Yorker, again, I've had people say things to me like, you're from up north and whatever. And over the years, I've come to find out that it's not what people think in South Carolina. I always thought that most people that were gay lived in New York or San Francisco. Okay, because the bathhouses and all this other stuff. But over the years, I've come to realize that you have a huge population of the LGBT community that's hidden. And although I'm a Christian, I may not believe in it, but they were already here. And so it's like, we don't think these things go on in South Carolina, but they do. Because like I said before, a person who's a transparent of New York, I was used to seeing that. I mean, my mother didn't take me to any gay pride parades, but 2008, I think, when Obama was elected, around 2009, that's when I really started seeing a lot of people of the LGBT community come out. So it's like, we always tend to think the South is very conservative, but you all are here. Y'all was just hidden. Thank you for the lesson.
Yeah, amen to everything you said. And I just want to, I should put Stonewall in the context there as 1969. It should be part of the context of how I talk about Don Langley Simmons. It's not just Loving versus Virginia, it's Stonewall that's changing the nation at that point, and I think probably increased the visibility of her marriage. And I just want to add to your comment about Stonewall, this is important again now with Trump's erasure of trans people. All of the federal pages for the Stonewall Inn as a national monument, they erased trans people from it. And it was a bar known for drag queens and trans people. So this is Trump's erasure of trans people is at the level of their autonomous bodies, but it's also at the level of history and information that's made available through federal sites.
Okay, you may want to also watch a documentary on Little Richard, one of my favorite singers. That also showed me that the LGBT, the trans community was back then when he was singing in the 1940s or 50s in these clubs.
Just wait.
Okay, all right, okay, so we're at 8:30, so we got time for a few more questions. Okay, Queen Quet and then Mona Fleming, and you serve your last question. Queen Quet, go ahead, please.
Peace and blessings all. Thank you all for the class. It's been powerful once again, especially the opening. I must give it to my girl, Salt and Pepper. But because we got back to this comment about erasure, it goes to what I raised my hand for earlier when we were talking about identity and how people use this terminology now as identity politics. But as someone who fought to make sure that my cultural group, Gullah Geechee, were known across the world, that we ain't just D or dry long so and thing like that, to not just keep us as a color, but understand that we are an ethnic group. Many people have stepped forward to tell me that they were glad that they now have an identity, that they understand that they're Gullah Geechee. But I know that then the National Museum of African American History and Culture is currently under attack. And one of the things they did was get Gullah Geechee items, museumize them, and then not reference them as Gullah Geechee, but put them and say they were African American, again, our erasure. And I did a video and posted on Gullah Geechee TV on YouTube about that when I visited the museum as a charter member and someone who was in the last of the last three in competition for the design of that museum. It was very painful to know that we were erased in that way. So this whole conversation tonight about the intersectionality, I have seen this happen in so many different ways of people attempting to erase one another, even in regard to women and gender politics and certain women wanting to exclude other women. So it's really interesting how all of this has tied together tonight for me. And so when I heard that term erasure, I said, well, I guess I will go back to my original comment, or I was going to let it lie. But I think we need to look at that people's identities and their full being needs to be allowed to be freely expressed. So it's not anybody else's political duty to come along and erase you or make that attempt to do so. So thank you all for continuing the work that you're doing to make space for people who want to express themselves in their totality. Peace and blessings, everyone.
All right, next, please. Go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to first say thank you to both speakers tonight, and don't worry about dropping the F-bomb. I was going to say ditto the whole time.
Oh, no, I teach Irish literature. And I tell my students that fucking just means very, and you just have to.
Well, as my sister told me, if we lived up north, she had to travel to Milwaukee a lot with her work. They use the F word like we use shit. So anyway, as Dr. Green would say, I digress. I did want to say to the comment on the Lexington 5 Richland removal of the book, this is happening all over our state. I've missed 2 of the classes and had to watch the videos of this class on Monday nights to go to the Anderson County Library Committee meeting. on the collection development policy. And then last Monday, I spoke at the library board meeting. And luckily, and a lot of people spoke against removing these books because they started, they started talking about the gender issues with the collection development policy. And basically, enough people spoke that they have postponed any approval of that development collection development policy. So there are folks out there fighting this because it comes down to bias and prejudice and not an erasing people. And so just wanted to say thank you for what you're doing and tell everybody in the class that people are fighting this across the state in school districts.
Thank you.
Go ahead, please. Sorry.
Question for you, and this is very hyper specific to Columbia specifically.
Okay.
With every movement we've talked about previously and the different, I guess, eras of movements, we've talked about specific things that were accomplished legislatively or in the courts, I guess judicially. What are the current targets we should be aiming for with this energy, with this, movement, organization for these queer issues in Columbia? What are some of the legislative targets we should be shooting
At the city level?
at the city level or state level?
Gotcha. Yeah. So Columbia, and I think I have, so the little piece that's in your folder from Proud Heritage, they wanted me to do a kind of broad history, but it had to be legal focused. And I think I mentioned there that Columbia was the first city in the state to include a non-discrimination policy for city employment and for public accommodations. Other cities have followed and other smaller cities have followed. We were also the first, sorry, I'm going to get the date on this because I know I have my little timeline here. We, in fact, through Harriet Hancock's leadership, and by the way, I noticed your comment, Becky. I'm sorry, I used was. Yes, Harriet is definitely very much still alive. But we, in 1992, the Greater Columbia Community Relations Council did a study called Achieving Full Participation. And that's what led to those employment and housing protections. So doing that kind of public study led to the legislative thing. I think the number one thing on our agenda right now is actually the fact that the city council is considering bowing to the, Attorney General Alan Wilson's extortion, let's call it what it is, that he wants to cut off funding to the city unless they get rid of their ban on conversion therapy. And they were, is it actually tomorrow night? Yeah. And so they may do it. And again, this is Alan Wilson. It's an election coming up, so he's got to find somebody to target and look better than Nancy Mace on being anti-gay. So
he has to outpace Nancy Mace.
He has to outpace Nancy. And by the way, can I just say this? Every time I see stuff about Nancy Mace in bathrooms online, I do hashtag Nancy Mace syndrome. Spread it, make it happen. Nancy Mace syndrome. They want to, and we did stickers. Want to pee? Nancy wants to see. So.
Yeah, so people were going to be providing those stickers.
I thought you were kidding, but okay, we want to do stickers that say "Gotta pee." Nancy wants to see. Put them in bathrooms everywhere.
Like,
oh, I love it.
Masses on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, the absolute last comment from Zoom. Keith, go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to remind people, in regards to book bannings, there are two levels of this battle. One is the Department of So-Called Education, which it controls the school libraries, and the secondly is your local library board, which tends to have a lot more independence. I'm speaking as a member of the Lancaster Library Board. And please, everyone, watch for openings on the library board and apply for them. That's all I have to say. Just keep up the good fight.
All right. Thanks again to Ed and Annie for a wonderful evening of education and learning. Absolutely. I think it's also, we appreciate you guys being here, even with the profanity and such, but I digress. See, I don't see, the thing is, I actually don't cuss in the Modjeska school because I'm always thinking, what if my parents watch this one today? So I'm like, I can cuss, but I'm gonna just.
My mom's not gonna watch this.
Yeah. So don't forget, next week, we do not have class. Next Monday is Memorial Day. So please take some time to think deeply about the nation's wars, our history of warfare and so forth. And also remember that Memorial Day began as a holiday right here in South Carolina. It was begun by formerly enslaved people in Charleston who wanted to honor the Union dead after the Civil War ended. And so Memorial Day, like so many other things in US and world history, can trace its lineage to right here in South Carolina. So we'll not meet next week, but we will be meeting the week after that. Keep that in mind. Brett, any closing thoughts?
Well, you just remind me, we will send out on Memorial Day, Blythe's column about the Charleston event, and that phrase that he headlined it with, forgetting why we remember. And it's really an important headline that you can wade deeply into with that. And to tell people that we're sorry we can't give you a piece of cake out there on Zoom land, but y'all can stay and talk about us eating cake. Thank you for being here.
All right. Again, thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful Monday night.
Thank you.